Picture this. It's the dead of night. Rain is pouring down over a contested Ukrainian settlement in the Zaporizhzhia region. A group of Russia's most elite soldiers moves through the darkness step by step, building to building. These aren't the expendable conscripts that the Kremlin has been feeding into the meat grinder for years. These are paratroopers, specialists, men who have trained their entire careers for exactly this kind of operation. They're equipped with anti-thermal camouflage to hide their heat signatures. They waited specifically for the rain to fall to reduce visibility, to make it harder for drones to track them. They're carrying something else too. Flags. Russian flags. Because the mission isn't just military, it's theatrical. The goal is to storm a settlement called Stepnohirsk, raise the flag on camera, and deliver Vladimir Putin the propaganda victory he so desperately needs. A picture. That's all it was supposed to take. A picture of the Russian flag planted in contested Ukrainian territory, broadcast across state media, replayed endlessly to convince the Russian people that their country is still winning a war that has now ground on for more than 4 years. It didn't work out that way. What happened in Stepnohirsk in late May 2026 is one of the most revealing episodes of this entire war. And not just because Ukraine destroyed Russia's elite infiltrators before they ever managed to raise a single flag. It's revealing because of what it tells us about the state of Russia's military, the desperation of its leadership, and the extraordinary intelligence capabilities that Ukraine has quietly built over 4 years of total war. This is a story about deception, intelligence, ambush, and propaganda. And by the end of it, you're going to understand not just what happened in one small Ukrainian settlement, but why it matters for how this war ends. If you're watching Daily Brief for the first time, this is what we do. We go deep. We don't skim the surface. We take the most important stories emerging from this conflict, and we break them down properly with sources, with context, and with the analysis that you won't find anywhere else. So if you haven't subscribed to Daily Brief yet, now is the perfect time to hit that button and turn on notifications. More on this story right now. Let's start with what was actually happening in Stepnohirsk before Russia's paratroopers showed up with their flags. The settlement itself sits just 30 kilometers south of Zaporizhzhia city, right along the strategically vital north-south E-105 highway. As the Kiev Independent reported on May 18th, geolocated footage confirmed Ukrainian armored vehicles operating at the highway crossroads in central Stepnohirsk, areas that had previously been firmly assessed by the Ukrainian battlefield monitoring system Deep State as under Russian control. That is how significant this location is. Control of Stepnohirsk doesn't just matter symbolically, it matters logistically, it matters militarily. It affects the trajectory of Russia's entire offensive push towards Zaporizhzhia city, which is one of Putin's most coveted prizes in this war. Russia has been attempting to advance along the eastern bank of the Dnipro River, aiming to bring Zaporizhzhia within artillery range. Holding Stepnohirsk is a critical piece of that puzzle. It provides a launching pad, a logistics corridor, and a psychological wedge deep into a region that Moscow claims but does not control. Losing it then was a serious blow. And here is where the timeline becomes crucial to understanding everything that followed. On May 18th, Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Agency, known as the HUR, announced that its Arten Special Forces unit had pushed Russian forces completely out of Stepnohirsk. As reported by Censor.net, Ukraine's security and defense forces had regained complete control of the settlement. The Artan unit, working in coordination with adjacent Ukrainian units, conducted what its commander, Viktor Takutuk, described as a series of active offensive actions in difficult urban conditions, clearing Russian forces from fortified positions and stabilizing the situation. Every building was checked, precision fire was used throughout, and footage of the operation was released to the public, showing exactly how Russian infiltrators had been dismantled. That footage stung. For Putin, the loss of Stepnohirsk on May 18th wasn't just a military setback. It was a propaganda disaster in a war where propaganda has become almost as important as bullets. And here's where it gets interesting, because rather than accept that setback, rather than regroup and plan a legitimate operational response, the Kremlin chose a different path. If you can't win it, fake it. That decision tells you everything you need to know about where Russia stands in this war right now. Toward the end of May, Russia deployed reconnaissance units from its airborne forces directly into Stepnohirsk. And let's be clear about who these soldiers were. Russia's airborne forces, the VDV, are not the cannon fodder units that the Kremlin has been throwing at Ukrainian positions in human wave attacks across Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia for months. These are paratroopers. They train specifically for deep penetration missions, urban infiltration, rapid seizure of key terrain. They are as close to elite as the Russian military currently gets, and they were sent carrying the flags of their country. We have seen this before from Russia. The tactic is not new. Send a small, capable unit into a contested area under cover of darkness. Have them raise the flag, take the photos, get out, then flood state media with the imagery, claim the settlement, claim the victory, move on before anyone can check the facts. It's a propaganda playbook that Russia has used repeatedly throughout this war. And in a country where independent media barely exists and citizens are legally barred from questioning the military's narrative, it works, or it's supposed to work. But in Stepnohirsk, Ukraine was waiting. According to HUR's account published on June 29th, as reported by United 24 Media, Russia's elite airborne unit entered Stepnohirsk during the night using the rain and their anti-thermal camouflage exactly as trained. They believed they were executing a clean insertion. They had no idea that Ukraine had been tracking them the entire time. The Arton unit had prepared for precisely this scenario. Rather than interdict the Russian troops on the way in, Ukraine made a choice that revealed the deep tactical confidence of its intelligence personnel. They let the Russians come in, they let them get close, and then they closed the trap. According to Huran, offered the Russian soldiers a chance to surrender. It was a genuine offer. Lay down your weapons and you survive. But Russia's elite paratroopers, trained to resist, indoctrinated to believe in Putin's cause, and legally terrified of what awaited them back home if they surrendered, refused. Russia criminalized voluntary surrender under pressure during the war, with soldiers now facing up to 10 years in prison if they give themselves up. So these men, surrounded, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered, chose to fight. What followed was a decisive, documented, complete elimination of the Russian unit. As Artan commander Viktor Totuk later stated publicly, the Russian group was effectively led into what he called a fire pocket. His precise words, as reported across multiple Ukrainian intelligence sources, were unambiguous. The so-called elite of the Russian army, he said, proved unprepared to face the systematic defense of HUR. Thanks to the dedication and professionalism of the soldiers, as well as coordinated cooperation with adjacent units of HUR's Active Operations Department and Ukraine's defense forces. Oppositions in the area of responsibility remain unreached. Critically, the operation was completed without a single Ukrainian casualty. And then came the footage. This is the detail that makes Stepnohirsk so much more than just another battlefield engagement. Ukraine didn't just win. Ukraine documented the win in meticulous detail and released it. We see the view from armored vehicles and tanks as Ukrainian forces roll through the settlement. We see soldiers divided into small units, checking house by house, running clearing operations with military precision, scouts running ahead, assault units following, ripping apart Russian positions piece by piece. And at the end of it all, the Russian flags that the airborne paratroopers had carried into steppe, noises for their propaganda photographs, were seized by Ukrainian intelligence as trophies. As United 24 Media reported, the flags intended for a propaganda victory became spoils of a Ukrainian one. If you're finding this analysis useful, this is a good moment to subscribe to Daily Brief and make sure you've got notifications enabled. We cover this conflict every week, and with the situation developing this fast, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's talk about why this moment matters far beyond Stepnohirsk itself. The propaganda dimension of this war has always been significant, but in 2026, it has become something close to existential for Putin. His ability to control the domestic narrative about what is happening in Ukraine is the scaffolding on which his grip on power rests, and that scaffolding is starting to buckle in ways that would have been unthinkable even 12 months ago. In April 2026, the Atlantic Council reported on research conducted by the Ukrainian non-governmental organization Lingvaleksa in collaboration with Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General. They analyzed survey data gathered from more than 1,000 Russian prisoners of war. The findings were remarkable. Soldiers who had deeply internalized Putin's propaganda were 6 times more likely to believe that the war Putin started in Ukraine was legitimate. They were 2 times more likely to want to return to combat. And nearly half of those surveyed embraced the ideology known as the Russian world, an imperialistic framework that promotes Russian civilizational dominance and frames military sacrifice as a necessary component of national destiny. Read those numbers carefully, because what they tell you is that the propaganda isn't just a tool for public relations. It is the fuel that drives men into combat and convinces them to die for a cause that is objectively failing. The Russian soldiers who entered Stepnohirsk weren't just following orders. They had likely been shaped by exactly this ideological environment. They believed enough to refuse surrender. They believed enough to fight to the end. And that belief, manufactured in the Kremlin's propaganda apparatus, sent them into a trap from which they never emerged, which makes what Putin is doing right now all the more urgent and all the more desperate. Because as of mid-2026, the indicators that Russia's military position is deteriorating are no longer ambiguous. They are data point after data point from source after source pointing in the same direction. In May 2026, for the first time since Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive, Russia recorded negative net territorial gains. As reported by Al Jazeera, Ukraine's commander-in-chief Alexander Syrski wrote on his Telegram channel that the ratio of liberated versus lost territories was almost 100 square kilometers in Ukraine's favor. The Institute for the Study of War, based in Washington, assessed the shift even more dramatically, calculating that Russian forces seized or infiltrated just 40 square kilometers in the final months of the period while losing control of approximately 281 kilometers. As the ISW noted in its June 1st assessment, Russian forces in May 2026 gained a presence in only a fraction of the territory they did in the same period of 2025. Their rate of daily advance had fallen from nearly 10 square kilometers per day in early 2025 to under 3 square kilometers in the first third of 2026. As reported by Ukraine's Pravda, the Deep State Analytics Group described May 2026 as the worst month for Russian territorial ambitions since October 2023. And Deep State added a detail that cuts directly to the propaganda battle we're discussing today. Their report stated that Ukrainian defense forces had improved their response to Russian infiltration tactics so significantly that it was becoming, in their words, increasingly difficult for the Russians to plant a flag or build up forces. Planting a flag, those were the exact words. In a broader strategic analysis, this is the summary of Russia's military ambition in mid-2026. Not breakthrough, not conquest, planting flags. Now, against that backdrop, look at what Putin has been saying publicly. On June 28th, Putin appeared on Russian state television and made a statement that for anyone who has been watching this man for years, lands like a thunderclap. He acknowledged that Ukraine's attacks on Russian energy infrastructure were creating problems. His precise phrasing, as widely reported at the time, was that strikes against critical infrastructure were creating problems and that this was, in his word, obvious. He then acknowledged the resulting fuel shortages across Russia. A few weeks before that interview, he admitted publicly that the military was not advancing in Ukraine as fast as he would like. These are admissions that the pre-2026 version of Vladimir Putin never would have made. He is a man who built his entire political identity on projecting strength, invulnerability, and forward momentum. For him to go on state television and say, yes, there are problems, yes, things are not going as fast as I want, represents something significant. It is not remorse. It is not honesty. It is a calculated attempt to appear relatable to a Russian population that can no longer ignore what is happening. Oil refineries are burning. Fuel queues are forming, and as CNN reported, Russian-installed authorities in Crimea declared a state of emergency as repeated Ukrainian drone strikes caused widespread power outages and fuel shortages across the peninsula. At the peak of the crisis, nearly 2,800 vehicles were waiting in line to leave Crimea via the Kerch Bridge, with roughly twice as many attempting to leave the peninsula as to enter it. That image, Russians fleeing Crimea in their cars while the infrastructure burns around them, is the reality that Putin's propaganda machine is desperately trying to paper over. And his failed flag-raising operation in Stepnohirsk was supposed to be part of that paper. Let's go even deeper, because the Stepnohirsk operation wasn't just about Zaporizhzhia, it was also about peace talks. On June 23rd, Putin told reporters that Russia was ready for peace negotiations with Ukraine and was prepared to proceed on the basis of agreements reached in Istanbul in 2022. Read those words carefully. A Russian leader unprompted publicly referencing peace negotiations and invoking a negotiation framework from 4 years ago. That is not the posture of a man who believes he is winning this war. As the Atlantic Council noted in a March 2026 analysis, Putin has been using talks cynically, primarily to avoid further pressure from Western partners to buy time to continue degrading Ukrainian infrastructure and to divide the NATO alliance. But the very fact that he is making these overtures at all signals that the battlefield pressure is working. Here is where the Stepnohirsk propaganda mission intersects with geopolitics at the highest level. A photograph of the Russian flag raised in a settlement 30 kilometers from Zaporizhzhia would have been leverage, real usable geopolitical leverage. Putin could have brought that image to any negotiating table and said, look, Russia is advancing, Russia holds territory, Russia's position is strengthening. You need to deal with us from a position of reality. Without that image, without that fake narrative, he arrives at the table with his actual hand exposed, and his actual hand in June 2026 is not strong. Ukraine understood this. Ukraine understands the information war with a sophistication that is often underestimated in Western commentary. It knew that releasing the footage of the Arten operation wasn't just about documenting a tactical victory. It was about denying Russia a narrative tool at a moment when narrative tools matter enormously. Every piece of propaganda Putin tries to manufacture Ukraine has become extraordinarily good at dismantling in real time. We saw this in Novotsilivka. On June 29th, as reported by military, Russia sent soldiers from the 38th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade into Novotsilivka, another village in Zaporizhzhia, with the same flag-raising mission. Ukrainian drones and an infantry response resulted in the would-be flag-bearers being captured rather than celebrated. A second attempt at a fake flag raising in the same month in the same region. The desperation is not subtle. We saw it in Vachansk back in December 2025. As Ukrinform reported, Russian invaders attempted the same tactic in the Kharkiv region. Soldiers from the 57th Separate Motorized Infantry Brigade of Ukraine's 16th Army Corps put a stop to it. Different region, same playbook, same failure. And we saw it most brazenly in Kupiansk also in December 2025, when Russia flat out claimed to have taken the city. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky traveled there in person and took photographs to prove that the claim was false. A Ukrainian counterattack then pushed out the Russian elements that had briefly infiltrated parts of the city. Russia claimed a victory that wasn't real. Ukraine proved it wasn't real. The cycle plays out again and again. But what makes Stepnohirsk different? What gives it a special place in this sequence is that Ukraine stopped the false narrative before it could even be manufactured. It's one thing to debunk a claim after it has been made. It is another thing entirely to intercept the soldiers who were meant to generate the claim, eliminate them, and then release documentation showing precisely what happened. That is a next-level information operation. It denies Russia not just the propaganda victory, but the attempt to create one. Let's also talk about the broader operational context, because Stepnohirsk does not exist in isolation. According to multiple reports from the Institute for the Study of War and from Ukraine's military intelligence, 2026 has seen a meaningful shift in battlefield momentum. Russia's rate of daily advance has fallen dramatically compared to the same period in 2025. Ukrainian ground counterattacks, combined with long-range drone and missile strikes targeting Russian logistics, have disrupted supply chains that the Russian military depends on to sustain offensive pressure. The February 2026 block on Russia's use of Starlink terminals in Ukraine removed a significant communications advantage that Russian troops had been exploiting. And Ukraine's drone forces operating at scale across the entire front have transformed the threat environment for any Russian unit attempting to move in the open. The Stepnohirsk trap is a product of this environment. Ukraine has layered its intelligence, its drone reconnaissance, its special forces, and its conventional units in a way that makes Russian infiltration operations extraordinarily dangerous. Even when those operations are executed by Russia's best-trained soldiers using their best counter-detection techniques, rain, anti-thermal camouflage, night cover, electronic warfare measures. The Artan unit's after-action analysis published through HUR noted that the Russian group attempted to act according to classic Special Forces doctrine, and still they walked into a pre-prepared fire pocket because Ukraine had a calculated response algorithm in place, because proactive intelligence neutralized the element of surprise before the Russians ever realized they had lost it. As reported by the Kiev Independent, drawing on analysis from the Finland-based Blackbird Group, Ukrainian forces had been launching a coordinated series of counterattacks in the direction of Stepnohirsk throughout this period, with analysts noting that Ukrainian forces would likely be able to stabilize the situation in the area. That assessment proved accurate. More than accurate, the stabilization came with the complete elimination of Russia's propaganda strike force. Think for a moment about what this operation required. Ukraine had to know that Russia was planning this specific mission. It had to track the movement of elite Russian paratroopers through the night through rain in an urban environment where thermal signatures were being suppressed. It had to position the Artan unit in the right location without revealing its presence. It had to coordinate with adjacent units to seal off the area. And it had to execute the clearing operation with enough precision and documentation to produce footage that could be released publicly within days. This is a level of integrated intelligence and operational capability that most armies in the world could not replicate. And here's the most important implication of that. For Russia's most capable soldiers to have walked into this trap, Ukraine had to have intelligence penetration of Russian operational planning at a level that should genuinely concern Moscow. These weren't random soldiers bumbling into an ambush. They were elite special forces who believed they had taken every precaution. Ukraine saw through every single one of those precautions. That suggests intelligence access that goes beyond drone surveillance. It suggests a picture of Russian military planning that Ukraine's intelligence services are reading in something close to real time. For Putin, this is a nightmare that compounds every other nightmare. He is facing an adversary that is getting stronger, more coordinated, and better informed, while his own forces are increasingly resorting to tricks and fakery because legitimate battlefield progress has become so slow and so costly. According to estimates shared with Russia Matters by a senior Western official in February 2026, Russia's military has now suffered approximately 1 million casualties killed and wounded since the start of the full-scale invasion. 1 million. And for all of that blood and treasure, Russia cannot fake a flag raising in Zaporizhzhia without Ukraine dismantling the entire operation before the first photograph is taken. That is the strategic picture in June 2026. That is what the Battle of Stepnohirsk reveals. Now, some people watching this will ask, does any of this matter if negotiations are coming? Isn't the war eventually going to end at the table rather than on a battlefield? That's the right question, and it deserves a serious answer. Peace talks are happening in a technical sense, as reported extensively, including by the Wikipedia entry on peace negotiations in the Russo-Ukrainian War and by the Cambridge Initiative on peace settlements. There have been multiple rounds of discussions involving Russia, Ukraine, and the United States in locations including the United Arab Emirates and Geneva in early 2026. But the core issues, territory security guarantees, the status of Crimea, and the occupied oblasts remain completely unresolved. Russia's demands include international recognition of its annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions and Crimea, Ukraine's withdrawal from NATO integration, and restrictions on Ukraine's military capacity. Ukraine's position, as President Zelensky stated clearly in February 2026, is that it will not accept arrangements at the cost of national sovereignty. The Atlantic Council, in a March 2026 analysis, argued that Putin has been using these talks cynically, seeking primarily to avoid further Western and to buy time. The battlefield data suggests that assessment is correct. As long as Ukraine is recapturing more territory than Russia seizes, as long as Crimea is under escalating pressure, as long as Russian oil refineries are burning, Ukraine holds more leverage at any eventual negotiating table than Putin's propaganda would have the world believe. Every failed flag raising in Stepnohirsk, every captured flag bearer in Novoselivka, every Zelensky photograph in Kupiansk makes Putin's negotiating position weaker and Ukraine stronger.